Hi there, Kris from Stone Age Gamer here, and welcome back to Stone Age Gaming. In this wonderful hobby of ours, there are a few things more exciting than a brand new console launch. Yes, a new game is cool, but a new system? That's a whole new library of games, and it's pretty exciting stuff. But one of the things that I love hearing about in the world of video games is the personal stories behind them. How did you get that platform, and what does it mean to you and why? I think that stuff's really neat, and so I went through my history, since we've got the Switch 2 coming up, of all the stories of how I got my Nintendo systems, most of which I did get on day one, or at least close to as far as I can remember. I'm old, but I'm not that old. But yeah, this was really fun trip down memory lane. So this is the first. I'm going to be doing these every couple of weeks leading up to the Switch 2's launch. This is the first one. It's going to cover the first 4 Nintendo platforms that I got, and please enjoy.
In the beginning, I was an Atari kid. I lived and breathed my Atari 2600 and its games. But one fateful day, I was hanging out with my neighbor Joey, and he told me that he had something that was way better. He had something called a Nintendo, and a game called Super Mario Bros. Naturally, I didn't believe him. What could be better than an Atari? Well, I was about to find out. I didn't get an NES at launch, making it the only American-released Nintendo home console I haven't owned on day one. I give myself a pass on this one though, because I was born in 1981, and as such, my ability to stay on top of all the latest trends in video games was fairly limited at the age of 5. I wish I could remember exactly how old I was on the day when I went to Joey's house and played the NES for the first time, but I honestly can't. My best guess that it was sometime in 1987, but I could be wrong. Regardless, when I arrived at Joey's house, I was equal parts skeptical and excited. The concept of video games looking better than the Atari 2600 wasn't really a thing in my young mind. I just kind of figured that's what video games looked like. See, I was only vaguely aware of arcade games at the time, since we didn't have any arcades near me, so Atari 2600 was it. Surely whatever this Nintendo thing was couldn't be that much better, right? He took me up to his bedroom, parked me in front of a small TV, and powered on this weird gray box. I asked him where the cartridge was, and to my amazement, he lifted a small lid on the front of the console. I felt like I was looking at something out of a science fiction movie. 2 separate titles scrolled in from opposite sides of the screen. One was Super Mario Bros., the other was Duck Hunt. In case you were wondering exactly how long it took for me to fall in love with Nintendo, that was it. As long as it took for him to press the power button and for me to see those logos scrolling across the screen. The graphics on even those logos were light years beyond anything my 2600 could produce. And bear in mind again that I had very little if any arcade experience at this stage of my life. Seeing a game's logo on a TV screen instead of just on the box was a revelation. I asked what Duck Hunt was, and he told me he'd show me after I played Super Mario. So he pressed start, handed me the controller, and gave me the basic instructions. Like I said, the game selection screen was enough to convince me that I needed an NES in my house as soon as humanly possible, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened when I actually started playing the game. When I held that completely foreign, joystick-free controller in my hand and moved Mario to the right, the screen moved along with him. You see, unlike Pitfall, this wasn't a one-screen-at-a-time thing. It's honestly difficult to put into words how much this moment affected me. The very concept of a scrolling screen hadn't occurred to me before. Every game I had ever played to this point had been a single-screen affair. This was the ultimate game changer, and I needed to play more. Unfortunately, it didn't take long for me to learn that I was terrible at this. I spent what felt like forever taking turns with Joey, and I couldn't get past level 1-2. When he was sick of watching me repeatedly die at the same spot, he decided it was time to show me Duck Hunt. I don't know how I missed it, but I didn't see the gun when I saw the NES console for the first time. I was so mesmerized by what was happening on the TV screen and this crazy non-joystick controller that I passed right over the big plastic zapper sitting right next to the NES. Joey put the gun in my hand and told me to shoot the ducks, and I thought something was wrong because I couldn't hit anything. A few seconds later, he showed me that I just had to put the gun right up against the TV screen and I'd hit every time. Sure, it was cheating, but we were kids. We played it until it's time for me to go home, and it was some of the most fun I ever had. Yes, even the clay shooting. When I went home, I couldn't stop talking about the NES. My sister got in on the action too, and we somehow managed to convince my parents that we needed to get one. I wish I could remember the circumstances a little bit better, but I know we got our system in 1988 because we got the Power Set, complete with Super Mario Bros. Duck Hunt World Class Track Meet combo cartridge, 2 controllers, the zapper, and the Power Pad. While my love of the Atari 2600 never truly waned, it wasn't long before my full-blown Nintendo obsession was solidified. I would bring games instruction manuals to school for reading time. I watched the Super Mario Bros. Super Show every day when I got home without fail. I went to see The Wizard in the theaters. I just didn't love playing Nintendo games. I loved the entire world of Nintendo. I was hooked for life. I could go on for days about the first time I played all that system's incredible games. I mean, take a minute to reflect on the catalog available for this thing. Every genre is represented in some fashion, and so many of them are still incredibly fun to play today. When I was 5, I hadn't yet experienced the amazingly fun anticipation of a new console launch. But the time between my initial experience playing Super Mario Bros. And when I actually got one of my very own to play at home was a pretty close approximation. So why do I love my NES? It's hard to choose just one reason, but at the top of the list would have to be the overwhelming sense of joy that the game worlds it introduced to me have brought me over the years. From lesser-loved stuff like Blaster Master and Kid Icarus to true video game staples like Mario, Metroid, Ninja Gaiden, Punch-Out, Castlevania, Mega Man, Metal Gear, The Legend of Zelda, the NES is a classic by every definition of the word. To this day, the worlds that video games create are what attracts me to them the most, and the NES was the birthplace of so many of my favorite pieces of fiction in any medium. Maybe it was the abstract nature of Atari games that started my love affair with video games in the first place, but Nintendo was a source of inspiration and imagination for me. Playing those games wasn't just a hobby, it was an experience. The graphics, the character designs, the worlds, and oh, the music. So much of my life has been set to the soundtrack of the NES's simple bleeps and bloops transformed into symphonies and rock tunes, and I have the Nintendo Entertainment System to thank for introducing me to legitimately some of my favorite music of all time. It is, and forever will be, one of the best gaming platforms ever created. Where the NES was the only American-released Nintendo console I didn't get at launch, the Game Boy is similar in that it's the only American-released Nintendo handheld I didn't get at launch. But unlike the NES, I was painfully aware of the handheld at the time, in all its dot matrix glory. I didn't have my own subscription to Nintendo Power until I was in my 20s, so I didn't necessarily get to read issues as they came out, or even in order. The majority of my exposure to the magazine came from my friend Jeff, and I'm fairly certain that's where I first learned about the Game Boy. My recollection of this time in my life is a tad sketchy because, well, it was obviously a long time ago, but if memory serves me right, I wasn't exactly dying to get my hands on one. Maybe I had convinced myself that there was no way my parents would be getting me one, so there was no point in stressing out about it, or maybe it was the fact that the graphics didn't look all that impressive. Maybe it was the name, who knows? All I know is that I knew what a Game Boy was, and for some reason I didn't care as much as you'd think. I'm also assuming I didn't really get the concept, because the first time I actually played one, any notions relating to me not absolutely needing to have one in my life flew right out the window. The Game Boy hit the US in 1989, which would put me somewhere in elementary school when I encountered one for the first time. I'm guessing 3rd or 4th grade. I remember the setting quite clearly. I went to Oceanville Elementary School, and since it was a remarkably old building and there were way too many students for the school to hold, there were these trailers set up outside where certain classes were held. I don't remember the exact circumstances, but this was one of those weird days where we got to watch a movie in school. Naturally, a group of kids were too cool for that, and gathered in the back of the room to do something else. I decided to wander back there to see what they were up to, and that's when I saw it. A kid named Ryan had a Game Boy in his hands, which I immediately recognized from Nintendo Power. Now, I wasn't exactly a popular guy. Few, if any, of the kids were really my friends, but among them was my neighbor, Joey. Yes, the same kid who introduced me to the NES. He told Ryan how big a Nintendo fan I was, so Ryan asked if I had ever played Super Mario Land. I remember thinking something to the effect of, excuse me, Super Mario what now? I knew the Game Boy was a portable Nintendo thing, but I didn't know there was a Mario game on it. Again, I don't know how I managed to not know that, having seen Nintendo Power before, but I do distinctly remember the surprise of Super Mario Land being a thing at this moment. I told him that while I was a gigantic Mario fan, I had never even heard of Super Mario Land. So he put his system in my hands, told me not to break it, and went off to play with the cool kids. It was the music that got me first. Hip Tanaka's Super Mario Land soundtrack is, in my opinion, just as good, if not better, than Koji Kondo's iconic Super Mario Bros. Score, and the moment I heard that music coming out of that tiny speaker, I was hooked. I marveled as I jumped on a turtle and it exploded instead of sliding across the screen. I stared wide-eyed as I got super balls instead of fireballs, but most of all, I stepped back and realized that I was playing Mario at school. With the power of the Game Boy, I could play video games anywhere I wanted, no TV required. When Ryan came to get his system back, I thanked him profusely for letting me use it. He brought it back to school a few times after that, and let me play games like Tetris, the Castlevania Adventure, and Alleyway during recess. I was so jealous and so thankful at the same time. I needed to convince my parents to get me one as soon as humanly possible. But I was unsuccessful at every turn. I can't stress enough that I am eternally grateful to my parents for their understanding of what video games meant to me growing up. Where lots of other kids would zone out in front of the TV, I can only assume that they recognized that when I was gaming, my mind was more alive than ever. That said, I played a lot of video games, and there needed to be limits. They weren't interested in getting me something I could play anywhere, so no Game Boy for me. I continued to play it at friends' houses and occasionally at school, but an actual original gray brick to call my own eluded me for a very long time. It wasn't until 1995 that I finally got my very own. I believe it was March, and Nintendo had just released their Play It Loud series of colored Game Boys. I had saved up some money, and on a family trip to the local mall... You remember family trips to the local mall? I went into the electronics boutique and purchased myself a red Game Boy. It's ridiculous to think now about how absurd it was that Nintendo was still selling bucket loads of a system with a green dot matrix screen while Sega and Atari were struggling to sell vastly superior competing hardware. But here I was, finally buying my own Game Boy, and I picked up a short stack of the games that I missed over the years, including Super Mario Land 1 and 2, Tetris, Alleyway, Link's Awakening, and the newly released Mario's Picross. My parents were right to fear the Game Boy. I took that thing everywhere, and I picked up as many great games as I could as often as I could. I never really got into Pokemon, though. That one never really clicked with me. Certainly a large factor was probably my job at FuncoLand during the Pokemon card craze and my subsequent desire to murder a Pikachu, but that's a story for another time. I got the new revisions as they came. The Game Boy Pocket's higher fidelity screen made my obsessive playing of Donkey Kong Land a far easier experience than it ever could have been on my original Red system. And when the Game Boy Color came along, Tetris DX made me fall in love with that particular puzzler all over again. The original Game Boy in all its iterations provided me with countless hours of gaming in bed, on car trips until I got car sick, out on family vacations, in restaurants when I should have been socializing with friends, everywhere. And when they released the Super Game Boy and I could play these games on my TV, I couldn't have asked for more. So why do I love the Game Boy? Like the NES, there are a ton of reasons, but if I had to choose one above all else, it was the weird sequels. Sometimes companies tried to simply replicate NES games on the monochrome handheld, but by and large, the games I came to love on NES got completely original and oftentimes radically different incarnations on the platform. Super Mario Land, Link's Awakening, Kid Icarus of Myths and Monsters, Metroid 2, The Castlevania Adventure, Ninja Gaiden Shadow, Wizards and Warriors X, Metal Gear Solid, Balloon Kid, Operation C, Mega Man and Dr. Wily's Revenge, Donkey Kong 94, the list goes on. Of course, the introduction of new staple characters born on the platform like Kirby, Wario, and even Conker, or stuff like that in a reasonably good port of Street Fighter Alpha on Game Boy Color are all reasons to love the Game Boy platforms. But those weird sequels were what helped introduce me to the concept of an unpredictable Nintendo. I've always loved not knowing where the company was going, especially when I thought I did and they turned out to surprise me. The Game Boy was wonder itself in handheld form, and while I still wish I had gotten one of my own sooner, I'm incredibly thankful that I eventually got it at all, and got to play so many great games with it. The Super NES was the first time I had ever properly experienced the sensation known as hype. I had of course been excited for things in the past, like when Mikey yelled, "God, I love being a turtle!" in the trailer for the original Ninja Turtles movie. I was beyond excited to get my hands on Super Mario Bros. 3 after the fantastic climax of the Wizard. Those things were effectively my entire world during their respective times. But true hype, the kind that gets in your blood and sinks into the very fabric of your being, the kind that keeps you up at night just imagining what it's going to be like after it happens, that's what hit me the moment I saw this. This is a page from issue 20 of Nintendo Power, and it was my first peek at what 16-bit Nintendo gaming was going to look like. Yes, F-Zero and Pilot Wings looked fascinating, but Mario was Mario, and holy cow did this look light years better than the already awesome-looking Super Mario Bros. 3. I must have read this page 100 times over at my friend Jeff's house. Yes, he was this one with the Nintendo Power subscription. Mario had a cape. He was jumping on dolphins. And look at the size of that bullet bill! The colors, the clouds in the background, the dinosaur he was riding, my mind lit up like a Christmas tree, and it only got more intense the closer I got to the system's release. And then I saw this.
Suddenly the sky is a little clearer. The water is a little bluer. The road's a little bumpier. The jumps are harder. The level's deeper. The character's smarter. The sound is hotter. The graphics cooler. The secret's darker. The danger's fiercer. The challenge a whole lot tougher. And suddenly the world's a more exciting place to be. Super Mario World. It comes only as part of the system you are created for. The Super Nintendo Entertainment System. The next generation from Nintendo. Now you're playing with power. Super power.
Sure, there were other Super NES ads out there, and most of them were very loud and edgy. This one, though, was the first one I ever saw, and it's still my very favorite commercial to this day. Everything about this ad is pure joy. The announcer injected this incredible sense of whimsy into it, and finally seeing what Super Mario World looked like in motion left my jaw on the floor. Then at the end, when they show that Super Mario World is just one of a giant lineup of games coming to the system, I kid you not, I could not sleep at night. My sister and I were all over our parents on this one, and somehow they wound up getting us one on what I believe had to have been launch day, or at least very close to it. We were allowed 2 games, one for each of us, including the pack-in. So I claimed Super Mario World, and my sister got F-Zero. Both were amazing, but Super Mario World kept me away from pretty much everything else for a very long time. I will never forget the feeling that came with opening that beautiful console box. One of the first things I did was look at the giant poster that came with it. Moments after unfolding that massive piece of paper, that hype that finally paid off with my shiny new Super NES started right back up again. Not having had unfettered access to Nintendo Power, I wasn't extremely aware of the first 16-bit Zelda game, but when I saw Zelda 3 at the bottom of this poster, I just about lost my dang mind. Of the 5 games shown, Zelda was the only one that said coming soon on it, and that was it. The hype train was back on in full swing, or steam. Zelda was about as big a deal to my little mind as anything could have possibly been. My favorite part of every week was Friday afternoons when the Super Mario Bros. Super Show played episodes of the Zelda cartoon. My mom made me a Link costume for Halloween. That everyone thought was Peter Pan, but whatever. Zelda was my jam, and after seeing what Super Mario World looked like, the gears wouldn't stop turning at the prospect of a new 16-bit Zelda. Meanwhile, I played Super Mario World like it was my job, then moved on to F-Zero, then thanks to the miracle of rental shops, tried out Pilot Wings, SimCity, UN Squadron, Super Castlevania 4, Super Ghouls and Ghosts, the hits, they never stopped coming. There was never a period of time during the Super NES era when I wasn't looking forward to some crazy game on the horizon. Whether it was seeing a screenshot of Super Metroid on the cover of some gaming magazine, I can't remember which, with the phrase, "How does Nintendo make games this good?" written underneath it, or watching that crazy Donkey Kong Country VHS tape, my Super NES was an unstoppable juggernaut of incredible gaming experiences. Sure, I enjoyed going to my friend's house and playing Sonic the Hedgehog and Quackshot, but as cool as the Genesis was, I never regretted my choice to stick with Nintendo even a little. The Super NES was and still is amazing in nearly every regard. I mean, think about the games released on this system. Chrono Trigger, Super Metroid, Yoshi's Island, Final Fantasy III, Turtles in Time, Contra 3, Kirby's Dream Course, Mega Man X, Super Mario Kart, Star Fox. There's almost no end to the amount of completely legendary software of every variety available, and it has some of the best controllers in history to boot. It remains my favorite console of all time, though I do have to admit the Switch is giving it a run for its money. Regardless, I could probably write a book about each individual game I played on the Super NES and why it was so cool. Or terrible. There were certainly bad games on the platform too. The unforgettable moments are too numerous to mention. So why do I love my Super NES? The reason above all else is witnessing unprecedented evolution in gaming. There's an argument to be made about the 16 to 32-bit generation leap being the biggest, and I can't really argue against that except to say that in that instance, we saw a huge leap forward at the cost of some pretty big steps back, where NES to Super NES was 100% forward. There was nothing at all superior about the NES after the Super NES came out, except in game library, but that's kind of subjective. The Super NES moved video games forward in incredibly exciting ways, and the best of those games, I believe, still look, sound, and play fantastic today. There are very few instances of great Super Nintendo games that haven't aged well. Even something as choppy as Star Fox is still as fun today as it was back when it released. The Super NES was the first home console where the in-game art direction came close to matching what was on the front of the box, and that's a sensation that's hard to put into context for those who didn't live through it. Sprite work in games like Super Metroid, Mega Man X, and Chrono Trigger displays a mastery of an industry that had grown and learned from the simple squares of the Atari 2600 era, and this stuff absolutely holds up. The 32 and 64-bit generation was magnificent for a number of reasons that I will get to soon, but there's no denying that a lot of it was ugly. Certain games managed to pull off their blocky looks with grace, but by and large, that generation was, to my eyes, the ugliest in all of gaming history. Meanwhile, the Super NES was stunning, and the best ways to truly appreciate that were through the evolutions of older series. I loved looking at my NES games and imagining what they would look like on the Super NES, and I was rarely disappointed. Oh, what I would have given for a Super NES Kid Icarus game. Super Mario Bros. 3 to Super Mario World, Mega Man 5 to Mega Man X, Castlevania 3 to Super Castlevania 4, The Adventure of Link to A Link to the Past, Metroid 2 to Super Metroid. These are all examples of true video game evolution, and watching them happen to this degree is something we're just never going to see again. Video game graphics have reached a saturation point that's becoming more and more difficult to top. Yes, I can look at a game like Horizon Zero Dawn and be impressed by how much better it looks than, say, Uncharted Drake's Fortune for PS3, but Uncharted wasn't exactly ugly to begin with. In-game graphics are straight-up representations of what the game's creators want you to see now. The only difference technology provides today is what fidelity you get to see them in, and how quickly you can get there. Back when the Super NES came out, that wasn't the case. In-game graphics were still interpretations of artwork, and seeing that leap from 8 to 16-bit was one of the coolest things I've ever lived through. What an amazing piece of hardware. Way back in 1995, the console wars were heating up. Everybody was talking about 32-bit this and 32-bit that. Nintendo's biggest rival, Sega, had released their CD-based Saturn on the market, and newcomer Sony had released their soon-to-be industry-alteringly successful PlayStation. Meanwhile, Nintendo was trying to stave off the competition with fancy new games on their aging Super NES hardware, and while they managed to give us some great titles in the process, their 64-bit Project Reality was still a ways off. The Big N had another trick up their sleeves, though. While many thought Nintendo was going to jump right over the 32-bit generation in favor of their new cartridge-based 64-bit behemoth, they actually did manage to throw their hat into the 32-bit ring. They just did it in the most bizarre way possible. I'm talking, of course, about the Virtual Boy. Branded as a sort of pseudo-relative of the Game Boy family, the Virtual Boy was this quasi-virtual reality thing that only played games in red. As for me, having drank the Nintendo Kool-Aid by the gallon back then, when I started seeing articles in various gaming magazines about this thing, I was very excited. Yes, it was weird, and yes, it could only display things in one color, but hey, the Game Boy wasn't in color for a long time, and with crazy futuristic 3D visuals, maybe it wouldn't matter. Then the ad campaigns hit, and they were weird. I thought this commercial was pretty cool at the time, but in hindsight, I probably should have had a lot more questions. But hey, I was young, and it was new Nintendo hardware. And seriously, look at that thing. I don't care who you are, there's no denying that the Virtual Boy is a cool-looking object. Forget practicality, forget the fact that it only displays in red. If you walked into a room and saw a Virtual Boy sitting on a table and you had no idea what it was, you would be intrigued. The designers at Nintendo did a fantastic job of making this bizarre machine, at the very least, look cool. Now it's time to discuss some stuff about myself that doesn't exactly paint me in a positive light. As a 14-year-old kid, I was all manner of awkward. I was bullied in school and had plenty of self-esteem issues tagging along for the ride. A big part of my personal identity was that I was the Nintendo kid. If there was something Nintendo related, I knew about it and probably had it. My parents had already promised me that I could get a Virtual Boy, but it wasn't going to be until a few days after the system launched. My next-door neighbor, on the other hand, told me he was getting it on day one, and I took that news badly. See, I had this long-standing jealousy of him. The two of us were friends, but he was far more popular than I was. He was better looking, got better grades, was more athletic, the whole 9 yards. He also tended to get things that I wanted before I did, and I was childishly jealous of him. So when I discovered he was getting the next Nintendo system before me, I was very upset. Of course, as an adult looking back, I know how absurd this actually was, but at the time, I was the Nintendo guy, not him. I should be the first in line to get the Virtual Boy, not him. If he got it first, that would make him better at being the Nintendo guy than me, right? I would lose that part of my identity that I was desperately clinging on to. I look back at the way I felt at the time with more than a little embarrassment, but the reason I'm sharing this less than flattering part of my personal history is to point out just how fantastic my mom is. She saw that I was upset and asked me what was wrong. I told her about how my neighbor was getting the Virtual Boy before me and how that was going to make me feel, And instead of trying to tell me that what I was going through was, well, completely ridiculous, because it was, she promised me that she would go to Toys R Us the moment they opened on launch day and get my Virtual Boy before anybody else. She could have taken that opportunity to teach me a lesson about not always getting things the way we want when we want them, but we were taught that lesson a lot in our lives. We brushed up against that poverty line quite a bit while I was growing up, but seeing how important this was to me, she decided that this wasn't the time for that particular lesson. I was so happy walking into Toys R Us that morning, partly because I was getting the new Nintendo system, but also because I couldn't even express how much I appreciated this amazingly kind gesture from my mom. Back to the Virtual Boy itself. Wow, what a system! I didn't have the opportunity to actually try one of these buggers before I got mine, so I was admittedly all kinds of excited to shove my face into it when I got home, and when I did, I was honestly impressed. It really was in 3D! The only game I had was Mario's Tennis, which was the pack-in title, and the moment Mario lobbed that tennis ball at my eyeballs and it bounced off the screen, I was sold. The 3D effect was exactly as cool as I imagined it being, and more importantly, Mario's Tennis was just plain fun. This was before Mario sports games were really a thing, so it was pretty novel to be running around as the Mario characters dressed in tennis gear, playing around and having a good time. The red didn't bother me one bit, and I was as happy as a kid could be. One aspect of the Virtual Boy that I didn't expect to have such an impact on me was the sound. This was billed as a 32-bit system, but there wasn't anything even remotely close to the sound of a Saturn or PlayStation coming out of my Virtual Boy. Instead, the Virtual Boy's sound was sort of like a Game Boy on steroids. It was all chip tunes, but with remarkable fidelity and incredible stereo effects. I'm sure that for most people this was a major turnoff, probably one of many, but to my ears it was magic. Each game I got managed to impress me with the 3D effects and sound in a remarkably unique way. I was still looking forward to the Nintendo 64 with near unrivaled levels of hype, but the Virtual Boy was successfully scratching my itch for some more modern Nintendo products. Or at least it did while it lasted. Games for the Virtual Boy were few and far between, and I didn't wind up getting many before the whole thing crashed and was discontinued. I got Mario Clash with my own money the day it was released and played it to death. I got Virtual Boy Wario Land as a gift and 100% completed it because that game is a masterpiece. I got 3D Tetris because I love puzzle games and I marveled at its spectacular music, and, well, that was it. I had 4 games. My neighbor and I think my other friend Adam also got Virtual Boys, and through them I was able to play Teleroboxer, Boxer, Vertical Force, and Galactic Pinball, but before I knew it, the Nintendo 64 came out, and the Virtual Boy's future all but disappeared. This was where I got incredibly lucky. On a family trip to the mall. Family trips to the mall. I hit up Electronics Boutique and came across a shelf with clearance Virtual Boy games, and I bought one of every single game I didn't already own. Looking back, I wish I grabbed a few more copies of games like Jack Brothers, and one of those boxed copies of Mario's Tennis sure would have been sweet, but I got almost the entire 14-game library then and there. The only game I was missing was Nestor's Funky Bowling and the box for Teleroboxer. But yeah, I got Jack Brothers and Waterworld for a pittance, both complete in box, so that wound up being a pretty sound investment. And you know what? There were no bad games in the bunch. Virtual League Baseball is a really fun retro-style baseball game if you play it in short doses. Panic Bomber is a really cool puzzler. Heck, even golf is a decent golf game. Yeah, Waterworld is pretty subpar, but if that's the bottom of the barrel for Virtual Boy games, at least US-released ones, that's not so bad. So, why do I love my Virtual Boy? First, I just love the fact this thing exists. I love that Nintendo had the fortitude to release such a bizarre and frankly flawed system on the market. There was no way this thing was going to succeed, but they gave it a shot anyway, and while it absolutely didn't pan out for them, the Virtual Boy has managed to build itself quite the cult following, and that's because it really was cool. Not mass market cool, obviously, but for folks like me who are fascinated by video game history, it's an absolute treasure. But more than that, I love my Virtual Boy because to me it stands as a physical representation of how much I love my mom. Money was always tight in our house, and my parents managed to find a way to get me a Super Nintendo, Virtual Boy, and N64 on launch day. I'll tell my N64 story soon, but the Virtual Boy, that kindness of taking me to a toy store early in the morning to buy this completely ridiculous thing just so I wouldn't have to go through the disappointment of watching my neighbor get the new Nintendo system before me, was amazing. As an adult, I know a lot more about how dicey our family's finances were in my youth, and that my parents were able to keep it together for all these years is really quite something. They went through some hard times, and they never let me know it. Yes, they frequently told me that I couldn't get what I wanted, but that day with the Virtual Boy taught me that every now and then, you just have to bite the bullet and treat yourself. Sometimes your kid's happiness is worth the fiscal irresponsibility. Even at the time, I had some inkling that this wasn't a financially sound move on her part, but she was doing it solely because she knew how important it was to me. And because of that, I appreciate my Virtual Boy more than just about anything.
Well, there you have it, folks. That's the first couple of stories in my history with Nintendo platforms. Really, really excited about the Switch 2 and going through these stories of what made the launches of these other platforms so special to me. We've still got a couple of months to go before Switch 2 when I'm recording this, so I don't really know what the story is going to be. I'm in a very different position in my life than I was even when the Switch came out. Like, things are different now, so I can't wait to find out what my Switch 2 story is going to be. And in the meantime, come back next time. We'll talk about the next chunk of Nintendo systems, and like I said, we're going to be doing this all the way leading up to the launch of the Switch 2, and hopefully it's just going to be a big fat ball of fun for all of us. So thanks for watching. If you like what you saw here today, please follow, comment, like, subscribe, share. Let us know, what were your stories? How did you get your NES, your original Game Boy, your first Super Nintendo? Did you get a Virtual Boy? And what did you think of these things? Like, what did they mean to you when you got them? Do you have any fun stories to tell about how you acquired these things? I love to hear that kind of stuff, so yes, sound off in the comments. Again, thanks for watching. On behalf of all of us here at Stone Age Gamer, keep playing games.